organizing this session, helping organize it. Thanks to Ruben and CIAT for hosting me, and thanks for putting together an interesting group of speakers. I'm just supposed to be the moderator, but of course I couldn't resist saying a few words, partially because I've always been interested in CIAT and a lot of the stuff that they've done, but I've never actually been here before. And so this has been a great opportunity to see what's actually going on. I've read about it, talked to a lot of people about it. And one of the reasons I've been so interested in CIAT for a long time is that it's sort of a model for the CGIAR and for other institutes of collaboration with the different parts of the private sector, such as Federos that we heard about this morning, and FLAR in the rice area, but also Corpo Ica, and the close relationship that they've had with Corpo Ica is I think really a great model. Perhaps only Erie and the Filipino research system have a similarly fairly close relationship. And then the other thing is that they've been open to a lot of partnerships with the private sector. The Dow AgroSciences collaboration on brachiaria comes to mind, and there are a number of others that I'm sure I've already missed. I like to think that part of the reason that there's been so much collaboration with the private sector is that so many of the director generals have been ag economists, right? And so the ag economists are not quite as afraid of the private sector, perhaps, as biological sciences. Is this true? I don't know. Anyway, this is a hypothesis that I have. So it's a great model, and it's been very interesting to watch it grow, and in recent years really do very well. The one other point that I'd like to make is the one set of organizations that's been largely absent from the discussion so far, but as we go into the future is going to play a bigger and bigger role, is China and Chinese private sector organizations, private sector, state-owned enterprises, et cetera. I mean, the most dramatic example, of course, is ChemChina's purchase of Syngenta, which has a big footprint in South America and in Asia and Africa. But there are other, maybe smaller things that might be under the radar. One is this CITIC Agricultural Fund, which is this huge state-owned bank, has just bought Dow Agro's maize business in Brazil as part of the agreement with to get antitrust approval of the Dow DuPont merger. I mean, the thing that may make this interesting to CIAT is that CITIC already owns the biggest share of the biggest rice seed company in the world, probably, which is Yuan Longping high-tech seed business. Now, who knows how CITIC, which is a finance organization, is going to put this all together, and whether it's going to be some kind of new important seed company or not, don't really know. But there are interesting things going on. I just read today that ChemChina and Syngenta, or Syngenta I should say, has also just purchased Nidera, the seed business of Nidera, which had been owned by a Chinese state company that's in food processing company. So interesting things going on. Capital being put into research and technology by Chinese companies, opening up new opportunities, I think, for mergers and not just mergers, but getting access to new technology. I think of Dabe Nong, who some people may know, one of the leading Chinese biotech companies, which has a collaboration with Bioceres in Argentina And Bioceres is, of course, closely related to INTA. And so that this is an opportunity where the Chinese biotech people hope that they're going to be able to commercialize some of their GM technology in Argentina. And Argentina is interested in it because, you know, it helps them get out from under Monsanto, perhaps. I don't know. We'll see. So a lot of interesting things going on and, you know, a lot of opportunities. And we're sorry, I should say first, I think that Geoff from DuPont did not, how should I put it? He didn't come just because Monsanto was on the panel. In fact, he didn't come because his flight got canceled, you know, and so he couldn't make it. So anyway, with too much talk from me, I'll now turn it over to Marco Ferroni.
So, thank you very much. I don't know if it's on.
You have to punch your little, Marco, you have to punch your button in front. Yep.
Can you hear me? Oh, yeah, when it's green. Yeah, right. Okay, so sorry, Mr.
No
Moderator.
problem.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the management for putting on this incredibly necessary discussion in the context of all of the sequenced discussions that you have put on, Ruben, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. So I think that the short answer is that since the term scaling up figures in the title of this panel, the short answer is that if you want to scale up at scale, not for 100,000 farmers, but for many, many, many millions, you need markets that are functioning, and therefore you need a private sector approach, and you need to be thinking about demand-led ways of scaling up as different from what we often do in the public sector, which is a little bit supply-led. Now, I'm not saying I know about size law, demand, I mean, or rather supply creating demand, et cetera, new things may require supply push, but ultimately the notion of scaling up through demand-led ways of thinking and going about it is superior when you've got proven products that are of commercial relevance. That is where the private sector comes in. I've just finished a 10-year stint as somebody running a corporate foundation, the Syngenta Foundation, as we have indirectly heard. And we operate as a incubator and developer of products and solutions for small-scale farmers in emerging markets and developing countries. And so that got us to think about, thinking about these approaches to scaling up and the role of the private sector and how to create markets or make them happen when they don't function initially. All markets actually work, you could say. Sometimes they work by not functioning because the government side of things is not right. And so we need to keep that in mind also. As different from simply invoking market failure in an often somewhat mindless way, because when something doesn't seem to be working the way we like to from a public policy perspective, we say market failure, but that requires a deeper reflection. Now, when you get yourself into this space in agriculture with a smallholder focus, then it is very clear that there are three spaces out there that need to be addressed. The private space, which is markets, the public space, which is the role of government, and public action, sometimes including donors, foundations, NGOs, and so on. In other words, non-profit, the non-profit sector that can supply catalytic push. And finally, public-private or private-public, which is where the two are working together. And I want to say a little bit something about all three of those and be as brief as possible. So, there's a lot of ambivalence about the private sector, and I would like us to think twice about this. I understand there are reasons, and there can be very good reasons for being ambivalent about the private sector. Let me say this too. But in general, in agriculture, a little bit of an open-mindedness with respect to what the private sector can actually deliver for the benefit of small farmers and poverty reduction and employment generation and fostering agricultural transformations would possibly do us good in the public sector. So, because sustained ag development, growth, and transformations are inconceivable, basically, without a dynamic private sector that's serving and driving agriculture and agri-food value chains. Now, of course, as we look at the world nowadays, as different from 20 years ago and certainly 30 years ago, there have been actually huge transformational changes in terms of bringing the private sector onto the scene, both on the technology and crop input, on the input side of farming, as well as the offtake and post-harvest type of farming. And we recently looked at this in a little bit of a systematic way. Some of us actually produced a paper on this, which is available somewhere, on India. And of course, our chairman has written about India on the input side and the whole crop science breakthroughs there. And clearly, the private sector and its influence is pervasive on crop technology and inputs, and as well as on the aggregation, processing, wholesale, and retail side of things. Now, this is a relatively new phenomenon, and it took the regulatory and liberating policy changes of the early 1990s to make this possible. The Green Revolution was a product of the public sector in that particular country. There was no private sector to speak of in that economy at that time. But the hybrid seed and biotechnology revolution of the last 20 years was clearly in that country a product of the private sector. Now, always in public-private interaction behind the scenes that we can discuss. I'm not going to go into that right now, but the driving leading edge for the hybrid seed and biotech revolution in India has been in the last 20 years clearly the private sector. The private sector invests in that particular country multiples of that which the government invests at all levels, state and union. And as a result, there are considerable contributions from agriculture to and the broader post-harvest value chains, which I include into agriculture now, into economic growth. On the social side of things and the ag transformation side of things, there are a few staggering statistics that I want to cite to you. Agricultural employment relative to the total was 60% in 2000 and 49% in 2013. Now that's a pretty good clip in terms of ag transformation. You can't have successful ag transformations without having fewer people engaged in primary production. Successful peasant is one with an off-farm job. Rural poverty statistics are as follows. This is India, 42% in 2004 and 26% in 2013. These are World Development Indicator data. The poverty data that I have just mentioned refer to the headcount index. Now, the government played an important enabling role in all of this, but the private sector clearly was was the driver of the process. And therefore, my lesson that I'm drawing from this is that much of what is possible in agriculture nowadays is actually determined by what's happening outside of the ag sector. And also, you can deduce from that where you have reasonable governance and good economic growth policies, you can expect miracles in agriculture that produce all sorts of value addition and so on, but are also good for the ag transformation and as my data seem to be showing, for another important variable to us in the CGIAR and in the public sector, which is poverty reduction, which is an explicit objective of the CGIAR. Happening in this case with early inputs, for example, in enabling the seed industry to come about in that particular country. There are clearly CGIAR and public sector research inputs, but by now, this is almost on autopilot, and we need to focus on other things, including, for example, having interesting recipes with respect to sustainability, and I refer to the previous panel, as well as to the question of what to do with the losers in the rural areas, because there are going to be losers and winners, and some farmers may not be able ever to participate in this dynamic that I'm describing here, because, for example, they may not have enough land to be really able to benefit from an intensification of agriculture. They may be benefiting as rural labor indirectly if yields go up and so on, but there is an issue there for social assistance programs and what have you. One other element that's happening, and this is still on India, and then I'll stop probably talking about India, that I was struck by when we looked at the data is how much more of farming is commercial now, of course, including small and smallest kind of farming, and how much more diversified agriculture has become, which of course is good in terms of because higher value products, vegetables and so on are good for nutrition, but they're also very good for farmer income promotion and so on. And I was at a conference in Delhi I think it was in June, where the chief economist of the Indian government, Subramanian, was saying, actually, he talked about agriculture, and there's a big debate going on in India, and he was saying, basically, we got two agricultures in our country. One that we love too much, grains, and another one that we love too little, vegetables and the like. And of course, in India, we're facing an interesting situation which must be affecting our strategizing inside of the CGIAR more broadly, because it has more global implications. It's not just an Indian phenomenon, which is how to move from a tradition of decades since independence of administering deficits to currently challenges having to do with the administration of surpluses. Now, the public, that was the private, or I wanted to say about the private space. The public space is all about enabling, it's all about the business environment, it's all about addressing negative externalities and distributional issues and so on. And we must recognize that none of the above, I've already mentioned this is a repetition, would have been possible without the right kind of public sector support. And I'm not here to say that in that particular country or in any other country that I know, the enabling environment is necessarily perfect. In fact, you go to entrepreneurs in that particular country and listen to their complaints about the problem of quote and unquote in India is a term, managing the government. So there are issues there, and it's also true that the government, of course, can, in extremis, choke off the private sector completely. The government has that power. So this is a big question of how to get the business climate right, and the business climate, of course, is a phenomenon that is made up of many different variables, and I will not say more about this. Now, in settings, and I'm getting to my last point. Oh, I'm talking too long. Public-private. Okay, so very briefly, what is the public-private domain? This is the pre-commercial domain, basically. So it's the space where we work to address incentive misalignments, number one. Number two, we work to negotiate and bring together the skills and contributions of different classes of actors that are needed. Their collaboration and their contributions is needed in order to generate desired outcomes. And finally, and this is particularly important for the CGIAR and in particular our crop commodity centers that work in breeding and which must be linked to seed businesses or seed distribution patterns. Public-private is where you build the partnerships for delivery of research results, and this can be shown with reference to seed systems and so on. CIAT is playing an important role. My former employer, the Syngenta Foundation, it continues to be, of course, involved in major ways with a very successful program of long-standing, the PABRA program in East Africa related to beans, now biofortified beans and so on, where we have genetics that has everything to do with CIAT and their strong national program partnerships in this instance, and donors and foundations bringing together the seed industry or fledgling young, local, small-scale, small and medium enterprise seed companies whose task it is to professionally multiply the seed and take it out to the farmers who are buying it, particularly when they are linked through aggregators where you have credit and other things and so on. This is a very successful program, and I want to end my remarks by congratulating CIAT and by saying that this is if you're interested in PPP, in the seed space, seed systems development space, look at CIAT and PABRA. Bill?
Thanks, Carl.
Sorry, I couldn't stop.
I spent the first 20 years of my professional career in the CG and now presently at the University of Minnesota. And one of the things universities hope they do really well is produce good human capital. So one of our star students is Ruben, who I thank for inviting me here. And he did survive the colds of a Minnesota winter to return to life back in Latin America. Another graduate of the university was George Hurrah, so he was 80 years earlier in 1935. And in John Lynham and Derek Biley's excellent retrospective on CIAT, which if you haven't read it, I'd strongly advise you to read it, because I thought I knew much of that history and learnt lots of stuff from reading that, so congratulations, John. They point out that George went down and was the lead of the Mexican agricultural program back in the ancient past, 1943. And he also was an instigator in the Colombian agricultural program in 1950, which gave rise eventually to CIAT in 1967. And for those of you who don't know, Harrar went on to be president of the Rockefeller Foundation from 1961 to 1972. So he was there funding and directing and conceptualising the establishment of CIAT and CIMMYT and IATA and the CGIAR itself. So he was, if you read through his history, he was extremely influential in that whole development. And so ideas give rise to institutions that have impact. And so I think that's part of the message that came out of John and Derek's book. And so the interesting point is that the CGIAR and CIAT were actually instruments of private effort. Now, it was private non-profit effort, but it wasn't public effort that gave rise to those institutions. It was private non-profit effort that was agile enough and could look at the opportunities and take the advantages that were presented at the time or create opportunities of their own. And so it was a research, Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, with the Kellogg Foundation, were the original donors that supported CIAT. USAID was one of the first early public sector donors to come in, so they came in 3 years later in 1970. And I just stepped back and reflected what the sort of institutional and economic realities of the world then, when that big institutional innovation took place. And so back in that day, in the early 60s, the US alone accounted for 1/5 of the entire world's public sector food and ag R&D spending. One country, 1/5 of the total. The rich countries collectively accounted for well over half of all of the public sector food and ag R&D on the planet at that point in time. We've just been finishing off some work doing a retrospective on long-run productivity growth in US agriculture, and it turns out that the mid part of the century, and particularly the 1960s, was an ahistorical surge in productivity, multi-factor productivity growth in US agriculture. And there was a general consensus, I think both political and general, about the role of science in contributing to that productivity growth and the well-being that stemmed from that. And so there was a major, I think, a sort of coalition of interests that gave rise to the public and policy pressures that sort of fostered the institutional innovations that gave rise to CIAT and the CGIAR. So the USDA and the experiment stations were sort of significant players back in that day. And in fact, for every dollar that went in to the land-grant universities, it was matched by $1 of private sector food and ag R&D spending at that point in time. I went and did some calculations just before I came down here. My estimates are, at that point in time, both public and private spending, China's spending relative to the US was, so the US spent 30 times more than China did in 1960 on public and private food and ag R&D spending. So let's fast forward 50 years to today, and what does that landscape look like? So the US's global share of public sector spending has shrunk from 20% to barely 11%. The rich countries are now spending well less than half of the global total on public food and ag R&D. There is more than $2 of private food and ag R&D going in for every $1 of public food ag R&D in the US. And the US global share of private sector food ag R&D spending is actually shrinking. Back in the day, decades ago, it accounted for about 33%, so in 1980 it accounted for about 1/3 of all of the private sector food ag R&D on the planet. It's now 1/4, by my estimates, of all of the private sector food ag R&D on the planet. The rise of the middle-income countries is the dominant, when you look at the data, it's the dominant trend that's going on. The rise of the middle-income countries are such that they now outspend the rich countries in public sector food ag R&D. And I'm about to release a paper which I've been trying to double check the data, and I now believe the data that my estimates are that China now outspends the US in both public and private food and ag R&D, and most of that private development, as Marco pointed out and Carl reflected on, has occurred in the last 10 to 15 years. And so while the US has actively been disinvesting from public sector food ag and R&D in real terms for the last 15 years, China has been doubling down, not just on the public side, but on the private side. And I think the ramifications of that globally for us to contemplate, I think they're going to be real and demonstrable. Moreover, amongst the middle-income countries, it's Brazil, India and China that have been the dominant players in that space. And so part of this shift away from the rich countries and away from the US in terms of the geography of where R&D is being deployed, it is due not only to a rise in domestic investments in these countries, but it's also increasingly an offshoring of multilateral activity in R&D in those market spaces. So if you go and look at the Cargills and the General Mills and the Pepsis and so forth, their marginal research stations are not in California or whatever, they're in Shanghai and Sao Paulo and elsewhere in the world. And, you know, rightly so, they're following the market, right? So the China constitutes a quarter by value of all of the world's food and ag R&D, food and ag production. So they're following market realities. So that landscape, I think, is shifting in terms of not just the geography of where R&D is taking place, but who's doing it. And particularly Brazil, India and China are rapidly doubling down in this private space as well as the public space. So we really need to think strategically going forward for the next 50 years of the CG and CIAT about those trends are in place. I don't think they're going to go away magically. And so how do we engage that activity in very creative ways? And so I was just going to finish with a couple of sort of homegrown examples from Minnesota about how do you think about engaging public and private research. A lot of focus is on the sort of technological aspects of that engagement. I would posit that sort of the software and the institutional design aspects, why wouldn't I, I'm an economist, as being important in actually facilitating collaborative efforts. So one of them is universities now, particularly post-Bayh-Dole in the US, but reflective in other countries where government-funded research, that the IP rights for that are now being ceded back to the agencies conducting the research, not in the agencies that funded the research. That's given rise to a plethora of growth in IP being sought and obtained by public entities, particularly amongst rich countries. But there's a major problem if you look around on how those technologies are deployed in ways that incentivise innovation and startups and spin-offs and so forth. And so one way is to actually radically rethink how IP is managed in public entities. And so University of Minnesota had very traditional sorts of IP management structures in their technology commercialisation office until about 8 years or so ago, when they did a review and found that in fact most of that IP, even when it's out licensed, doesn't generate much, if any, rents. It might generate knowledge generation and some startup activity and a shift in institutional structures, but the licensing processes were totally moribund with sort of lawyers up front arguing over the attribution and splitting of rents that never really materialised. And so the university totally radically shifted its IP structure and so streamlined its IP licensing agreements substantially, so it's now the fourth largest out-licensing university, public or private, in the US. Simple little things like, let's just agree on a 1% royalty for any revenues generated out of innovation once it hits a $20 million threshold of royalties. And most innovations never ever hit that threshold of royalties. And lots of other sort of streamlining. So there's things you can do to actually change and accelerate the out-licensing of those technologies. In terms of partnering, both in licensing and collaborating, and going beyond thinking about the private sector as a venue for funding CIAT research or the University of Minnesota research or whatever, and truly thinking about partnerships, that's also entrenched with worrying about sort of intellectual property and the distribution of the rents from that. So if you've got public research that's being funded by taxpayer dollars, there's a concern about that being co-opted and the rents for that research being captured by the private sector, and vice versa. The private sector has shareholders that don't necessarily want to give away the farm by putting stuff over the fence into the public domain. So we've been doing a lot of active work, as have other universities, in terms of really thinking about how to co-locate private researchers on public campuses, but with a very strong focus on identifying where the pre-commercialisation line begins and ends, and making sure that public-private research doesn't get co-opted into public benefits being co-opted into private spaces and so forth. Thing also along similar lines about where that pre-commercialisation line begins and ends in terms of trying to get collective action around so-called orphan crops and so forth, where there's, even in the US, there's smaller value crops that don't get the attention that they ought to. So one we've been doing, oats for example, is a multi-billion-dollar business for PepsiCo, who actually consume about a third of the entire world's food-grade oats. but there's very little activity of substance that's pushing major innovations in that sector. And so we've been working to sort of get a global collective of competitors, direct competitors to PepsiCo, working in a joint venture arrangement on research that's in this pre-commercialisation space and still preserving their private space at the back end. So finally, in terms of data sharing, so there's lots of great efforts going on with respect to open data sharing, but you can only go so far with that in terms of incentivising public-private relationships, because there's very little incentive for a private company to put all of their hard-won data into a public domain. So we've been spending a lot of effort trying to think about data sharing protocols where the data provider gets to say who sees what within their data set as a way of sort of unleashing and liberalising joint research that hinges very heavily on these data attributes. So I think lots of opportunities to innovate in that space. Just my final comment is my real concern when I look at the data is this huge bifurcation going on between the sort of scientific haves and the scientific have-nots. So the major target of lots of CG activities in sub-Saharan Africa, and if you look at the data in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of R&D investments, they're dismal. So that gap is large and growing. The amount of private effort in that space is very, very minuscule for very fundamental reasons, that these are very smallholder producers, fragmented markets, very distant to market problems, so lots of logistic problems. We did some estimates that something like the average time to the cropland pixel in sub-Saharan Africa is 6.8 hours, and half of that time is off-road. So just think of the logistics of getting inputs in and outputs to markets and so forth. So there's things that lie beyond innovation systems that have to be addressed to be able to unlock innovation capability in that area. But I think the bottom line is that there's lots of opportunities for creative innovation spillovers into sub-Saharan Africa through, as Marco said, at the end of the day, it can be small, medium, large companies. They've got the comparative advantage to deliver the final mile to farmers, and we need to think about how to create the relationships to both go beyond generating innovations to actually delivering them on the farms.
Yeah, so I spend my time looking for small, innovative companies all over the world and seeing how we can put money behind those companies to help them make growers more successful. So that's the one criteria that we look at Monsanto Growth Ventures when we invest in a company or look to make an investment in a company. If this technology works, is it going to transform agriculture? That's number one. And two, is it going to make farmers successful? And we've made investments all over the world, primarily in the US, but also in Europe and Eastern Europe and in South America as well. So that's sort of that's my day job. But I just realized I've been doing my other job now much longer than I thought. So this is a special time for me. It was about 25 years ago when I was about 8 years old and an assistant professor at Purdue University. Was walking down the hallway to sort of find some more greenhouse space for my rice plants when I ran into Maury Levy, who's sitting over there in the corner. And Maury's a population biologist and ecologist and geneticist, works on populations, and I'm a molecular biologist. I just work on stuff in test tubes. But I'd found some bits of DNA that looked like they would be useful for doing DNA fingerprinting to track the rice blast fungus, a very prevalent and significant disease in rice fields throughout the world. I had no idea what to do with it. But Maury did, and we started a collaboration and realized that solving rice blast in America was not the answer. We had to sort of figure out how could we use these tools elsewhere. And someone said, there's an institute down in South, there was another institute, I'm not going to say it, but we didn't get a response from them. But we contacted CIAT down in South America, and I remember Maury loading the fax machine, and we put all our data and pictures of gels and all this stuff in the fax machine at Purdue, and sent it off to some place called Cali, Colombia, that neither one of us could have even found on a map. And lo and behold, that same day, the fax comes back, right, with a letter, please send all your stuff down, we really want to work with you, can't wait to have you come down to Cali and visit. And I was like, wow, I got to figure out where Cali is. So I elected Maury to go. I decided I had to get my lab going. I didn't have tenure, he did. So Maury came down to Colombia, and it transformed his life, it transformed my life, it opened me up to international agriculture. I finally understood how international agriculture was funded. It got me out of my test tubes and into the rice fields. It was a transformative event for me. And then lo and behold, about 20 years later, I get a phone call, or actually it was actually an email, from Joe Tomei, who I'd known when I first came down here, with an opportunity to come and join the CIAT Board of Trustees. So this is my 25th birthday. It's been 25 years since Maureen and I published that first paper with CIAT, with Fernando Correa, with Cesar Martinez, and with Robert Ziegler. Wherever you guys are, here's a call out to you guys. So it's a really special time for me to be here. I want to talk about the sort of public-private partnerships from the perspective of a venture capitalist and from the perspective of entrepreneurship. While public funding may be going down for ag, the good news is that venture capitalists have gotten really excited about food and agriculture. And the reason is they see a $5.4 trillion industry. That is, if you were to roll in all the drinks and beverages and confectionery and everything into food and ag, it's about $5.4 trillion, one of the 3 biggest markets in the world. Considered by McKinsey, a big consulting group, to be the least digitized industry in the world. This is a report that McKinsey put out about 4 years ago. What an opportunity for the Silicon Valley venture capitalist who's sitting in Silicon Valley that's only 2 hours away from $36 billion of farm gate value in California, right? So it was a perfect match. You had the cost of computing coming down, the ability to do computing in the cloud becoming cheaper and available to everyone. Mobile technology was becoming more ubiquitous. Essentially, we were all carrying supercomputers in our pockets, and the opportunity to use that technology to revolutionize agriculture was just beginning to grow. And this was in 2012. When I joined from a private equity group, I joined Monsanto to lead their venture capital effort. And this was not lost on Monsanto. And we led the acquisition of Climate Corp, a 400-person software data science group sitting in San Francisco. There was no one there that I think had even planted corn. Changed Monsanto forever, turned it into a data science company. And right at that same time, CIAT launched their data science group and began to sort of bring that kind of technology to agriculture. And so the unique aspect, I think, that has kept CIAT at the cutting edge of what it does is an open mind towards innovation. Where is the next innovation coming from? How can we bring it to use it for farmers and smallholder farmers? How can we use it to revolutionize ecosystems and bring about important change in agriculture? And Ruben made a great comment in his, he always thinks I don't read what he writes, but I do. So he made a great comment in his editorial. You know, we've solved the problem of more, better, cheaper, and faster in agriculture. We now have to solve the problem of more, better, fairer, and cleaner in agriculture. And I think the chance to do that is going to be through innovation. Innovation used to sit at the big companies. Remember, you used to buy your car at Ford, and it was NASA that went to space, and it was the government that delivered technology in big companies. And that's not true anymore. It is the small, innovative companies that are delivering technology. In the last few years, venture capitalists have poured about $12 billion into food and ag technology companies. If you were to add into that the $10 billion that goes into biotechnology companies and leveraging, let's just say, $3 billion of that, that's about $7 billion being pumped into innovation in food and agriculture. And it's covering all kinds of different areas that are going to impact growers around the world. So it's not just data science and imagery and drones, which is what everybody thinks about, but it's things like automation. Agriculture is still physically very intense. In the US, it's the second most dangerous job you can have is to be a grower. And so bringing about more automation to make farms safer, to reduce the amount of time and reduce labor is still a critically important thing. It's not just in those areas, but also in genetics. And it's already been mentioned, we're seeing a revolution in genetics that's going to make breeding much, much faster. It's going to make it more efficient. It's going to help us deal with climate change. We can't have a 10-year breeding program to solve a climate change problem. We need a 3-year breeding program to solve a climate change problem. And that's the hope of all the new genetics that's starting to come out, things like gene editing, that if we use it in the right way, we can really accelerate the genetics of crops that have been very, very difficult to work with. So I'm excited about the opportunity that's sitting before CIAT and for its future. I think CIAT has been at the forefront of thinking about open innovation. We actually have on our board, and we added a new board member last year, she's an entrepreneur. She's got one of the leading data science companies in the world, and it's sitting in Africa. And to have an entrepreneur like that sitting on our board, thinking about how technology from Silicon Valley and elsewhere gets to smallholders around the world, I think puts CIAT at a great position to take advantage of what's going to be a very exciting future. So thanks very much.
As many people know, I'm never have been very good at timing and things like that. And with such interesting presentations, why I don't feel like I have to apologize. So I think we'll be allowed to have a couple of questions. Okay. So questions, answers, comments? Yeah.
I'm a farmer's son, and I've always been surprised at this difficulty of working with the private sector because, I mean, farmers are private sector. Also, my father, I can remember when I was on the farm, we were always experimenting. And I have a feeling that we're not counting this in the money which is going into research when we're saying the research effort. And there are tremendous opportunities out there now in the same way that they do crowdfunding and crowd of this and crowd of that, getting crowd research done by farmers themselves. If you get a whole lot of farmers trying different things, recording well what they're doing, we may be able to do particularly management research, maybe not genetics and things, but we may be able to do management, cropping systems type research much more cheaply than we're doing it at present, and getting much better results because they're done actually on the farm and not on little plots.
Yeah, great comment. I'll just take one second. You know, why not farmers doing genetics? I mean, you know, they're set up these biohacker labs on farms. You know, let them do that. I went to the biohacker thing, GenSpace, it's called, in Brooklyn. You know, the basic course was 3 Sunday afternoons to learn a little bit about, you know, gene editing, and then not gene editing, about just the basics of biotech, and then you can take another course in CRISPR, you know, and put CRISPR to work, you know. So in a month easily, you know, you could get you and your family out there developing your own crops. I mean, what the heck? Anyway, go ahead. Sorry. Other responses?
Yes, I mean, you're totally right. Farmers are evidently the private sector, but there are, in agriculture and food, there is a reality that it is for some people an emotional subject, and there are participants and contributors to public opinion that don't necessarily that are not necessarily completely free of ambivalence about the private sector. That's really what is happening. But yes, farmers are entrepreneurs. Every single small-scale farmer, woman farmer operating, I don't know, half an acre of rice in Bihar is an entrepreneur, makes decisions at the margin. The only problem is that she may not have much reserves in terms of capital and other resources. And as a result, when unhedged errors happen, such as climate problems or so on, it can have dire consequences. I want to say something about farmers experimenting. Yes, absolutely. That's why in West Africa they call a crop une spéculation, a speculation. A crop is a speculation, and that embodies the notion of. Now, with digitization and the comments that our last speaker made, we're going to have huge opportunities, of course, to generate data that, for example, will spell the end of field trials. Because we can bring together so much more information to make decisions down to the level of granularity in terms of the resolution that is unheard of. But it still requires that keenness on the part of the farmer in terms of willingness to experiment.
So do either of you guys have burning responses? Or shall we get another question?
Yeah, let's get another question.
More questions?
It's getting late in the day.
Yeah, solved it all. Okay, so let's give the panel a hand. Very interesting session. Thanks.